Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week. That was my introduction. I'm filling in for Dr. Neri, the pizza man, today, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Ed Crowther, who's going to be talking to us today about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and competing visions for civil rights.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Stephen, for the kind introduction, and thanks to our benefactor for pizza. I think this is how we ensure a healthy commemoration for Dr. King Week. Before I begin, I want to call your attention to what is sort of the educational focus of the week. Tomorrow night in Richardson Hall Auditorium at 7 p.m., we have the distinct honor and high privilege of hearing an address from one of the leading scholars of the history of the American South, particularly that intersection between or among race, poverty, religion, and politics. And he's here with us right now, Dr. J. Wayne Flint, Professor Emeritus from Auburn University. Along with his wife, a long-suffering wife of half a century, Darty Smith Flint, who's here too from down in Alabama. And so they're experiencing both altitude and temperature in ways that we all went through when we first came here. So welcome today on behalf of the Grizzly Activity Board, the Black Student Union, the Office of Academic Affairs, the Department of History, Government, and Philosophy, and the Department of Teacher Education, and Adams State generally. So thanks so much for turning out. I've had the distinct privilege since 2009 of being directly involved with the planning of King Week, and my contribution, I suppose, as a historian, was to try to talk about Dr. King as a figure in American history, the problem of memory in United States history, and of course King the Baptist, King the civil rights leader, King the figure who has a national holiday, and why that's so. And one of the things that's been consistent, apart from the decibel level of my voice, has been an attempt to try to move us past the simple storytelling trope that's a product of really the human condition. We like stories with a moral, we like stories with simplicity, we like stories with happy endings. And if those are things for which you are after, you will be disappointed. Because really the story about Dr. King is a lot about unfinished business. It's about challenge. It's about what Dr. King called redemptive suffering in a United States that was a mixture of material abundance and racial violence. And so it's a story that has some uplifting moments, the triumph of the human spirit, and it has some very painful moments that tweak the heart and conscience of any observer. How many of you have been to Washington, D.C. since the King Memorial has opened on the National Mall? And so the rest of you need to go to the National Mall. The King Memorial is located between the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial along the Tidal Basin. I can't think of a better place in that city to put the King Memorial. And of course, in many ways, if there's a way that a monument reflects some of the challenges of understanding the past, you can look and the artist King is stern, ambivalent, optimistic, hopeful. He's all of these things. There's an ambiguity in the way that King is depicted. And I think for once, and it's happened at other places, that makers, artists who make monuments have gotten at some of the complexities and contradictions of Dr. King. A lot of people know that King was this African-American civil rights leader, but maybe don't know much about his specific biography. Here's the outline. There'll be a test before you leave. But this is the piece that I want you to understand about Dr. King. This is what he said about himself. I am first and foremost a Baptist minister. And that affected both the breadth of his vision as a civil rights leader and some of the challenges of trying to affect social change. Ministers operate in a religious dialectic of converting people. And that's different, Dr. McNeil Smith, than social engineering, right? And so it opens up possibilities, but it brings with it challenging problems. King did not get a national holiday because of his biography or because he was a Baptist minister. He was seen as the fulcrum of a civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and in many ways he was seen as its martyr. The Reverend James Lawson referred to the assassination of Dr. King in April 1968 as a crucifixion. And that's a wonderful term, I think an accurate and fair term to capture King's role in this, I would say, still unfinished movement. And so beginning, and this is what, King is 25 years old when history happens to him and pursuing a much different course. He really saw himself as becoming a pastor of a major church in an urban center, doing things in the social gospel tradition for the African American community. But there's no way in the world, the documents don't support this, there's no way to tease out in King's early life and career any inkling of the role that he would say providence caused him to play. Right? But that history, when it happened to King, called him from obscurity to an international stage. You become an international figure when in 1964 they give you the Nobel Peace Prize. You become a figure for world history. And it's an amazing pilgrimage, but it's one that of course comes at a high cost when King is assassinated on the night of April 4th, 1968, outside room 306 of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. After you go to the National Mall, I would invite you to the city of Memphis to go to the National Civil Rights Museum. It is not a happy visit, but it's a worthy visit to kind of remind yourself of maybe the historical path through which white, black, brown United Statesians have co-struggled and about the possibility of what remains to be done. There is a feel-good about Dr. King. And I want you to think, as I play this famous video clip for you, about the juxtaposition between vision and the means for obtaining that vision. These are King's most famous words, delivered in August 1963 on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And of course, you get an opportunity to perfect your Dutch if you were following along with the slide or the YouTube. You know that in some ways it's hard to find, although Dr. Flynn and I might know a few people over the years that might not share that vision of Dr. King of equality and inclusiveness. But the problem was, and the problem is, how does one bring it about? And the methods that Dr. King chose to bring about moral and social and legal change at the time were controversial, as they may be in some people's minds today. But of course, King is a controversial figure. I just wanted to talk about this a little bit. The statue in the Washington Mall provoked controversy from all sides. African Americans wondered, surely in the United States we could find an African American to create the wonderful figure of Dr. King on the Washington Mall, and not someone from Asia. Here we go again. You know, when we work with the state finds so many ways to remind us of our marginal status. And then this part I just loved. And Dr. Savaldi, you can relate to this. I've done the same kinds of things. From a well-meaning perspective, you as a bureaucrat do something that is unbelievably inflammatory. The idea was King was a little too menacing. He was an angry black man. And white people don't want to be reminded of angry black men. We want Dr. King to be sort of a grandfatherly and almost Santa Claus figure with a clean-shaven face. And the King on the Mall is menacing, broad-shouldered and menacing. And so they said, well, you need to redo your design. Now you can imagine how the artistic community would respond to that bureaucratic flap. Who are these pin-headed bureaucrats to tell us about pure creativity? And so I love this. With minor modifications, Yuxin made some cosmetic changes, but really, if you look at the original design and the final product, not much difference. But the fact is that even in memorializing a figure like Dr. King, in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, there was ongoing controversy about how even to remember King. But that's not unusual. When the King holiday was signed into law by President Reagan, after President Reagan threatened to veto the bill, states exercising their rights as states refused to declare the King holiday a state holiday in their particular jurisdiction. It took the National Football League Players Association and the power of money to force Arizona, a state that has issues. I like to think of Arizona as sort of the Mississippi of the Southwest, a state with lots of issues, to recognize the King holiday. And of course, whether we're in sociology class or in history class, whether we're doing public policy or political science, the debate remains. Just what did King actually achieve? Are we better off for King? Would things have happened in a more durable way without King? These are debates that people have. But I would remind you that a figure like King was always controversial. This is my favorite King clip. So, you'll know what side I'm on a lot of issues when you hear this. This is King at Ebenezer Baptist Church.
Make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You're too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power, and I'll place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name. Be still and know that I'm God."
Those words in that particular version that were uttered at the end of April 1967, while the United States was in the midst of continuing its escalation in the War of Vietnam, did not earn Dr. King any friends. I'll tell you that your president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, simply began to refer to King as that nigger preacher. Let me suggest that wasn't a compliment. And there were many people in the civil rights movement that said, "Martin, you've lost your mind because you've lost your focus. It's about civil rights at home." And Dr. King, he had once written, "Injustice anywhere where is a threat to justice everywhere," and at least he was consistent. The imperialism abroad was a symptom of the acquisitive materialism that promoted economic disparity at home and racism at home. And so for Dr. King, it was a seamless garment, a moral issue that had to be addressed. But the point is, even in King's life, at the heyday of his public career, he was a controversial figure. Even this was controversial. Controversial at the time, and when others have tried it in their movements, controversial from then to now. But King's idea of promoting social change was to use nonviolent resistance, a sit-in, a march, to call attention to a situation, and mostly to produce what he called creative tension, to compel the state as an actor to enforce what were really difficult to justify norms. Think of Gandhi walking to the sea to make salt in violation of a British law. Or think about marching to protest in behalf of hiring African American workers. And it bothers people. And so the police come in and arrest marchers for disturbing the peace. The marchers say they are petitioning for redress of grievances. But the idea is that often the state as an actor will overreact in a way that brings attention not only to the condition the marchers are complaining about, but to the evil, immoral, unconscionable means that we use to impose certain customs, certain practices, certain interests. And so, today, when we're in sociology class or history class, we talk about this virtuous movement. The distortion of time obscures the fact that when King was doing this, lots of people, black and white, said, "You're disturbing the orderly congress of people, the orderly exchange of goods and ideas. And besides, real men stand up and hit back. Real men file suit." And within the African American community, as well as within the majority communities of white peoples, this nonviolent resistance that King is generally positively remembered for was very, very controversial. I stole this from a marvelous historian at the University of Pennsylvania, Professor Barbara Savage, who's one of the leading scholars of the African-American religious experience in the 20th century, and particularly that sort of tangled skein, that challenging intersection of gender within African-American religion. And she said, you know, one of the things that King does accomplish that's more or less unalloyed today in the 21st century, this is not so controversial. So if you wanted to say, well, here's something that King does and there's not much debate about it, we tend to think of nonviolent protest as more or less normative. It's more or less acceptable as long as it doesn't get out of hand like English soccer fans allegedly do when their team loses. Just one of those things. And this is the other thing that Dr. Savage says is important. Professor Flint will talk tomorrow night about the idea of black church and black churches. And the fact is that something as broad and as diverse as African American religion can't accurately be spoken of as a singularity. I'm about to highlight a controversy between Dr. King as a leading Southern African American minister and a Northern African American minister, and you get the idea that it was possible in the 1950s and 60s for African American religious leaders to disagree with the means, not the vision, but the means to achieve social and economic justice in the United States. And one of King's great achievements in his role as the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to more closely align the varieties of African American religious expression, but particularly Protestant African American evangelicalism, with an activist crusade for social justice. This is a strand in African American history that is as old as African American history, but under Dr. King it becomes mainstream and becomes normative, and it's a tremendous achievement. And I want to highlight, and I hope this doesn't become too academic, two episodes that illustrate why nonviolent activism and religiously based activism were not exactly normative in King's time, and what King dealt with to try to overcome that opposition to religiously based activism. And of course, the other piece is to capture some of the texture that's lost when we simply think of the civil rights struggle as being all about Dr. King, who represented all black people, against this monolithic racist structure of unitary whiteness. It was much more complicated than that, which perhaps maybe makes a stronger case for King's ultimate achievement. In the 1960s, King faced a number of struggles, but one place where he struggled was in 1963 when he responds to the call to go to Birmingham to participate in a quest for political and economic rights in the city of Birmingham. It's a very, very famous scene. This is the one, you know, where you see the police and the fire department with hoses and police dogs demonstrating their fitness as heroes against African American adolescents on the streets of Birmingham. And in that process, during that time, King goes to jail, and while he's in jail, just after he's in jail, 8 of leading white clergymen in Birmingham say to Dr. King, you shouldn't have come, and you people need to be more patient, more gradualist in your approach to civil rights. Later King, and I'll get to this next, but later King would feud with Joseph Harrison Jackson, the pastor of Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago. When King went to Chicago, the leading black Baptist minister said, you shouldn't come. These groups, I'm going to argue, have a common vision, but they have a strong dissent about the means to achieve the vision. So Dr. King, you read this when you were a student, right? Dr. King is very famous for writing, on toilet tissue in the margins of newspapers, what's ultimately published as a letter from Birmingham jail. And it's a very famous document. You know, he says, I came to Birmingham because injustice is there, and that's what activist ministers do. We go to try to make the crooked places straight, to make justice a reality. And so today, we teach this in curricula all over the United States. But at the time, these views of King were not even completely normative in the African American community. And of course, we juxtapose King's letter from Birmingham jail to the tepid, immoral, evil, self-interested, monolithic white Christianity that was extant in the city of Birmingham. Now, I almost wish that were true because it would make my job easier. King's the good guy and everybody else is evil and they're kind of like Hitler. But my job is not that easy because the facts don't support this. Prior to the ministers writing the letter, the Good Friday statement, Martin, you shouldn't have come, they issued a law and order statement, which could be read, you know, if you're a student of American politics, well, when whites talk about law and order, they really mean keeping brown and black people in their places. So this is what historians do. We go to the source. We look and see what's actually in the letter. And this is what I find fascinating about the letter issued before King comes to Birmingham by the 8 clergymen. It's hard to find something here to disagree with. You can read this for yourself. So I'm not going to do what they do with PowerPoints and read to you. It's hard. I mean, look at this, right? And then I think this gets better. No person. I mean, when you say no person, I guess you mean white folk and non-white folk. And so what's fascinating to me is that in this Birmingham community of white ministers, part of the debate is not so much about the ultimate ends. It's about the means to attain racial equality. Now, here are their names, right? I want to show you the picture of one of these people. Rev Earl Stallings was the most prominent Baptist minister in Birmingham. And while the marches were going on in Birmingham, he actually invited African American congregants to worship in his church. Now, I can remember as a young white person, and we had an African American in the early 1970s come to First Baptist Church in Vicksburg, and people talked about it for a decade. It was controversial. And if you saw the movie The Help, you can understand these sort of strange worldviews of my people, the Southern whites. But the point is that this guy, who is viewed as sort of this retrograde racial moderate, as a white minister to invite African Americans to worship in his congregation, actually, in the context of the time, was doing something extraordinarily courageous. That is, to the very best of his ability. He took the dictates of the New Testament, that God is not a respecter of persons quite literally. And it even meant to challenge the own racial marrow that he inherited as a Southern white person. And so the point is, when we think about the civil rights movement, we have people like Dynamite Bob Chambliss, the person that blew up the 16th Street Church in Birmingham. I can't find much good to say about this guy. He's a hater. And then we find people that don't want to rock the boat. And then we find people who are going about as far as they can, given their racial inheritance, their socialization, and their belief structure. And over time, you know, we look back and we say, well, surely he should have known that Dr. King was really one of the good guys. And my point is, he does sort of know that Dr. King is one of the good guys, and he just doesn't know what to do about it. It's the problem between a shared vision, but no agreement about the ends to achieve that vision. By the way, the best scholar right here, Jonathan Bass, has written a wonderful monograph on these 8 clergymen, and it's a book worth reading to challenge our willingness to accept simple truths for a more complex reality. The reason we're having this talk today is because of the talk last year that Reverend Billy Kyles gave. He had just come to Alamosa from preaching at the Monumental Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we were sitting in what Wayne has dubbed my solarium. We were sitting in front of the fireplace. He loved the fireplace because it was cold. And he said, I just came from preaching at one of the largest African-American megachurches in the United States. And he looked at me as if I should understand. And do you know who used to be the minister there? He says, and this kind, gentle man sort of shifted gears. Reverend J.H. Jackson. And I vaguely, from something I had read in Baptist history, knew that there was a story here. But I resolved to try to understand why Reverend Kyles, who is associated with Dr. King, he's with Dr. King when King was assassinated, would in 2011 be so angry about a fellow minister, Joseph Harrison Jackson. So I've been working on that. Here's the deal. This is the skinny. And the point is, what I'm going to argue is that King and Jackson agree on ends. They don't agree on means. And get the point. 2 leading African-American ministers at the same time not agreeing on King's strategy, right? And so Martin Luther King and Martin Luther King's father, long-time association with J.H. Jackson, who had been born in Rudyard, Mississippi in 1900, and like many of the lucky ones, escaped from Egypt to the promised land of Chicago's South Side. And in 1942, he becomes the preacher, the pastor at Olivet Baptist Church, and was eventually granted life tenure at that church. He becomes, after a long period, he becomes the president of the National Baptist Convention, which was a fellowship of about 7.5 million African-American Baptists at that time. It was the largest African-American organization in the United States at that time. And here's the problem. When he becomes president of the convention, the civil rights movement happens. And now you're the president, and people ask you to do presidential things, which typically means do it my way. King and his young associates wanted the National Baptist Convention to come out and support wholesale, massive social and legal changes and a kind of activist demonstration-oriented strategy to achieve those changes. Jackson wouldn't do it. King and the young Baptists, including young Billy Kyles, marched out at Kansas City, much like Southern Democrats in the 1860 Democratic Convention. They march out of the convention and they form the Progressive National Baptist Convention. A smaller group of African-American Baptists, but wholesale committed to a kind of activist social gospel Christianity that included nonviolent direct action to attain redress for social and legal and economic inequalities. And so needless to say, after 1961, you want to see that ministers can say bad things about each other. The correspondence where King talks about Jackson or Jackson talks about King doesn't put either man in a very favorable light. It just shows that human beings engaged in work they believe that is important can easily demonize people who seem to be an impediment. By the time it's all over, when Martin Luther King moves to Chicago in 1966, and we're looking at housing discrimination and job discrimination, Jackson says, you know, he calls King a powder keg activist. That is, when King shows up, things get worse, not better. That was Jackson's view. In the scholarship today, Jackson is simply dismissed as an Uncle Tom. A term, by the way, that is a bizarre one. If you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, to call an African-American cowardly, that's not how Uncle Tom is depicted in the novel, but that's a whole nother story. Maybe that'll be next year. But the point is, Jackson and King agree about the real-world applicability of Christianity. They just differ mightily over how to bring this about. And so Jackson says this is the problem with nonviolent resistance. It overturns the system. It doesn't enhance the system. And just for the sake of getting us through this, the problem is really almost a generational or socialization thing. When Jackson is forming his worldview, he is part of a movement within the African American Baptist community that's focused on global evangelism. And so religious schism among Baptists interfered with that work. Secondly, and this one's hard to capture if you didn't live through it, if you were a United States citizen and a Christian, it was hard to imagine a more ominous threat than the ideological and military challenge of the Soviet Union, right? And that's Jackson's world. As bad as Jim Crow is, Uncle Joe Stalin is worse. As bad as Jim Crow is, the materialism inherent in communism is more destructive to the soul than any force on the earth. That's Jackson's view. Right? And so the point is, we have a disagreement over means. And this disagreement over means is really the source of a lot of the controversy. Now, it can be read that people, you adopt law and order when law and order favors you. And that's a very, very fair criticism. This is where Dr. King is, at least in 1963, and I've heard this a lot in the African American community. They say, you know, it's you smiling white boys that make me nervous, because I don't know where you stand. You give me an honest bigot any day, because I know where they stand. And so, you know, for people like Dr. King and for many people in the movement, the debate about what are the proper means to achieve social change was seen as a pretext for doing nothing, right? That's how it was viewed. And so what I wanted to conclude with is kind of a, you know, some things to think about and discuss, and I want to hear from you. I think this is sort of the easy one because it doesn't take much. It doesn't take many people to block change. It takes everybody to affect change. It doesn't take much to block change. But the point here is, how do you know what means to pursue? When is disrupting the machinery appropriate? And how do you know? Is there a metric? You know, do we become Benthamites and say, well, the greatest good for the greatest number? And the problem with that is, how do we define good? And really, how do we define number, right? So, here's Dr. King, a figure today that enjoys a broad amount of sort of cultural admiration in the United States and globally. In his day, depending on who you are, you might have found him to be very much a troublemaker, right? So, what would be your answer? When is it right to disrupt the system in order to change it? And how do you know? That's your essay question. So what's your response? Yes?
I think it's difficult when we look at it historically, because our country, for example, started with acts of vandalism, such as we're going to break into a ship and we're going to throw the tea in the harbor. We're going to throw stones at the soldiers. Sometimes that's effective, other times it's not. So it's a tough balance to know when does the ends justify the means, and that's a big philosophical question.
Yeah. Oh, we'll start right here.
I was going to say, it just puts more of the onus on us who are comfortable in our situation to affect change, because we're the ones who could probably do it in a more nonviolent, effective way than the ones who are the evil people or the people who are being oppressed.
Yeah, the good example for this is J.H. Jackson says, kings should look to the electoral process. That's the whole problem. If you try to vote, we'll kill you. Okay? So yes, where we sit at the table often determines our answer. Yes, Julie?
It's always kind of seemed to me that moderates can't get anything done.
Right.
They'll be ignored, and you've got to have the rebels. Am I correct on that? When has a moderate approach to change worked?
Yeah.
There's revolutions all over.
Yeah.
I mean, could they have gotten anywhere?
Yeah. I wonder. And you know, I think when you look historically, when consensus emerged, it sort of tips, at least in my historical analysis, the advantage to king. When you saw the police dogs, even as an otherwise indifferent, comfortable person, you know, it was wrong. When I worked for the Southern Poverty Law Center, we often got help from otherwise, I'd call them racist, because they did not approve of big adults beating up small minorities. That crossed a boundary, so they said, no, I don't want to go to school with them, but no, violence is wrong. So there's something about that creative tension. Back here, Anthony was...
I feel that if Dr. King would have had violent demonstrations, he would have triggered the annihilation of the black population at that time.
I agree. And let's explore this a little more. One of the things I would just say, I'll challenge you, is listen to King's own words when he talked about the problem of violence. And the little hint is, it's not what I do to you, it's what my instinct for violence does to me. So violence, in King's mind, violates this sort of natural law as it applies to humanity. Michael, I thought you had your, oh, you were just throwing. Yes, right here.
I feel like it's important to also recognize the other militant radical black movements of the time, like
Yeah,
Black Panther,
absolutely.
the Nation of Islam with Malcolm X, excuse me. And when we talk about moderation, many blacks, more radical blacks and militant blacks saw Martin Luther King is very moderate, and he was able to play off the more radical, militant self-defense attitudes of Malcolm X to further his cause. So if it wasn't for the other portion of the militant black radical movement, Martin Luther King wouldn't have been able to gain as much ground as he had.
Yeah, he's the more attractive alternative for many. Yes?
I just want to jump off of that and say that, you know, it was those more aggressive, more liberal groups that allowed King's stance to be seen as moderation, which I think is the whole point of your presentation today. And I just want to, that question really bothers me. When is moderation in pursuit of justice not a virtue? I think moderation in itself is never in pursuit of justice, but in pursuit of order, right? Right. Using the vocabulary of your presentation today. And we look at the Occupy movement, right, which is a nonviolent movement that is moderate, but is seen as very extreme. And it was started in kind of an extreme liberal light, and then gained all of this momentum. I kind of think of it like a football fan club, right? You have those people who are diehards who root for their team no matter what, and then you have those people who jump in at the end that really add the momentum to the movement that carries it through, right? And what King's moderation, these Southern Baptist moderation jumping in at the end added the momentum to achieve the goals of the civil rights movement.
And what about when the moderate is perceived by a majority group as too radical? And so that's the other side of that. Yes, you.
Well, I guess I was thinking about the Occupy movement as well, and I guess I see things a little bit differently. One of the questions I was pondering as you were speaking was you mentioned that one of King's contributions to current society is creating that nonviolent movement as something normal and part of not necessarily status quo, but not as controversial.
Right.
And so has that happened to the extent that nonviolent protest really becomes ineffective? And that
it's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I often think about this because of being a president of a black club and being new to being a president of a black club on this campus, and we trying not to look too radical to black students and to other students as well. I think we've been more effective by being diverse and saying, hey, let's join up with this club and seeing what they want to do at Spanish Club, whether it be Circle K or any of those other clubs. The more that we group together to work on one cause is a more effective way.
Yeah, that's right. Somebody better say something or I will. And that's not good. Yes?
That's what I started wondering today was, had he not been assassinated, would he have had the stature that he does now?
I almost made it more about that. We won't know because we'll never know what King's presence at the Poor People's Campaign would have done. It had the potential because of the reallocation aspect of making the Poor People's Campaign seem really radical. At the same time, it might have posed an opportunity for national dialogue about how to affect justice being prodded outside the system, but affecting justice within the system, and we'll never know. What we do know, a lot of division in the movement. King had lost some of his erstwhile allies. After the Watts riot, the larger civil rights consensus began to, if we could even speak of that accurately, began to be frittered away. And so there is something about, dying before you're 40, keeps you from having to deal with the possibility of having your platforms rejected on a much larger scale. So, there is something to that. And, historians really aren't good at counterfactuals, but it's a worthy question. Okay. This is the last slide. And I did this is just over the top. This is 1966. Have things changed? Read the signs. And so, just as recently the neo-Marxists have made a comeback after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the economic conditions that we're all confronted with, do pose an opportunity for us to go back and reconsider the economic justice aspect of King's message. I'm not even sure that I like the term civil rights leader, because the focus is on sort of procedural rights in the system. I'd like to think of King as a human rights leader. And then, of course, that poses another question: just what are those rights? And what are the means to bring those rights into fruition? So I want to thank you all for coming. I want you to come out tomorrow night and bring your friends. Bring 10 friends with you, one for each finger. That way you won't be doing bad things with your hands. 10 friends, and come see Dr. Flint tomorrow. But thank you so much for turning out today.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.